Welcome back to another episode of Remnant Stew. I'm your host, Steve, and today we are talking about epic disasters, from explosions to huge storms, floods, and train crashes.
Leah here. Buckle your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
If you have an appetite for the strange and bizarre, then pull up a chair and grab a spoon for another intriguing serving of Remnant Stew. Remnant Stew is gluten-free, organic, made from all natural, free-range ingredients, and guaranteed to provide the recommended daily serving of curiosity.
You know, Leah, let's look at our calendar.
Okay.
Coming up here. Actually, yesterday, June 20th, was Father's Day, so we hope all you dads had a great day out there. If you missed our last episode, it was all about inspiring and interesting dads. So we hope that you'll go back and take a listen to that one. Now, depending on where you are in the world, either yesterday, June 20th, or today, June 21st, is the summer solstice. So happy solstice, everybody.
Happy Solstice Day.
It was officially 5:44 p.m. Eastern Time in the United States on June 20th, but most of Europe and Africa and all of Asia, so for all of our listeners over there and in Australia, the day it was already past midnight, so for those folks, the solstice fell on June 21st. Now, worldwide, June 21st is acknowledged as International Day of the Celebration of the Solstice. Have you been celebrating? What are we going to do to celebrate the solstice this year? I don't know.
I don't know. That
caught
brings
me
to
off
mind
guard.
all kinds of Celtic.
I didn't put out the solstice lights or anything, but well, anyway, this date was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly on June 20th, 2019. The observance brings awareness to the importance that solstices and equinoxes have for many religions. These days have special meanings for Jews, Muslims, Christians, and also many indigenous cultures throughout the earth. So,
okay. Do you want to explain what solstice and equinox and what the difference is?
The equinox is the first day of spring or the first day of fall.
Right.
Depending, first day of spring in the northern hemisphere, first day of fall in the southern hemisphere, which is usually March 19th or 20th. And then the second equinox is usually around the end of September 22nd or 23rd. And that day is the day, or those 2 days actually, are the days when the sun's rays are directly over the equator.
That's right.
And the entire Earth gets the same amount of sunlight. But the solstice
is the opposite.
Is where the sun reaches its highest point in the northern hemisphere. The direct rays shine as high as 23 degrees north of the equator.
Tropic of
Cancer.
I can remember if it's Cancer or Capricorn. It's
Tropic of Cancer, and then so that's as high as it gets in the northern hemisphere. That's on like today, June 21st, and then the Tropic of Capricorn is the winter solstice for us in the northern hemisphere. For the southern hemisphere, it's the summer solstice for them. And so that's usually December 20th or 21st, depending on whether it's a leap year or not.
I think all of that is so fascinating.
Right, it is. It's all about Earth movements here on Remnant Stew. Well, also, there are some other important holidays to note. This Friday, June 25th, is Take Your Dog to Work Day.
I can get behind that. I can't. My boss won't, but I could absolutely get behind that.
Well, bring the dog.
Do it working from home.
Your dog's at home with you, Phil, right?
She just comes with.
Okay, next time we record, bring the dog up here to our palatial studios
that would
here.
be cool.
Right?
Yeah, that would be all right. And maybe we can get him on microphone. Mic up the dog. What's your dog's name?
Rowan.
Rowan,
and he's a rescue.
Rowan the Rescue. Okay.
That's right.
It's let's see. It's an observance that was created by Pet Sitters International in 1999. It originated the day to celebrate the great friendship between humans and dogs. Pet Sitters International encourages businesses and companies to allow their employees to go to work accompanied by their dogs. So June 25th, Take Your Dog to Work Day.
And I think that's a fantastic day because dogs just, you could get a whole lot more work done just because they relax you. Now, is there a take your cat to work day? Because I'm thinking there's not.
Well, my cat, I don't have a dog right now. I do have a cat, and generally the cat just sort of relaxes with me when I'm at home doing whatever. So, but cats are a little different, a little less predictable,
a little
I
different.
suppose.
That's one way to put it.
Right.
Yeah.
A little less predictable. Now, next week on June 30th is International Asteroid Day.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, take your asteroid to work, no?
Bring your rock with you.
Yeah, there you go. Now, this is a global awareness observance that aims to educate and inspire. Educate and inspire. That's what we try to do around here, too. Educate and inspire people to know more about asteroids. They're part of the formation of the universe and how they can be useful. I'm not really sure I would know how asteroid could be useful. Anyway, the observance was founded by the astrophysicist Dr. Brian May in 2016. The Asteroid Day was officially observed by the United Nations. The observance occurs annually on June 30th, and this date was chosen because it marks the anniversary of the Tunguska impact in 1908. And what a coincidence.
Which you're going to talk about a little bit later, right?
Exactly. That's one of the disasters that we are going to.
So that's right. So when you talk about asteroids, I think more about disasters or near disasters rather than the way they can be hopeful. So
right.
that
seems to be more the case of a disaster related to them. Then I'm not really sure how they can be helpful. We'll have to do further research on that.
That's right.
Well, I mean, we do get to see when they do land what kind of makeup they have as far as minerals.
Well, that's true.
So,
we learn more about the universe by studying them, I suppose.
Eventually we could go mining.
Oh, that's right. That's right. There has been some research on that.
I've just remembered, I was sitting at a place way out in West Texas, near Fort Davis, Texas, the McDonald Observatory. It's way up high in the mountains out there. It's run by the University of Texas. Mm-hmm. And they have this thing called the Star Party. And it's really fun at dusk. The skies are brilliantly bright. I mean, that's the part of Texas where the stars at night really are big and bright. And so just as the star party was starting, as they were beginning to point out things, a shooting star, I don't know if it was an asteroid or a comet, just absolutely split the sky right overhead from where we were sitting, and everybody went, "Oh!" And of course, the guy directing it said, "Thank you very much. We had that organized here at the University of Texas." Well, back to our topic now, disasters. Leah, I've never actually personally been involved with an epic disaster, but I came really close one time. When I was a teenager, I have a cousin named Melanie, beautiful girl.
I think a lot of stories start that way. I have been involved in a disaster back when I was a teenager. Right?
Yes. My cousin Melanie, beautiful girl, and she had a knack for talking me into things. And she was actually a barrel racer. Now, for those of you who don't know what barrel racing is, it's an equestrian event in which several barrels are placed in a pattern, set out in a large area in a pattern, and the horseback rider attempts to maneuver around the barrels as quickly as possible. It's actually a timed event.
Right.
Well, my cousin needed to practice her barrel racing, but she was short one barrel. So she took me out into the pasture and said, "Stand right here."
So you were a stand-in.
That's right.
See, I think that's cousins' jobs is to
pretty much.
Yeah.
I was
talk
too dumb
you into things.
I was too dumb to realize that I'd just become the replacement barrel. So I stood right where she told me to, and she backed her horse up about 30 yards, and then to my horror, she started charging right at me. Fortunately, I was too scared to run, so I stuck like glue to the spot where I was standing. Quickly, Melanie skillfully spun her horse in a tight, neat little circle right around me, and then went right on to the next barrel. And that's a good thing that I didn't move, because it would have been an epic disaster had I taken a step one way or another. The horse would have collided with me, and I would have been the worse for it, I think. But I didn't volunteer for any more practice sessions after that.
So there were no stitches or blood?
No, it
or
was just a
anything
very near epic disaster. But,
if that's a disaster, then I've been in more than my fair share.
Too close for my comfort,
and my
though.
kids as well.
I bring it up to my cousin every time I see her.
We have personally, at our house, we've frequented many ERs. But actually, we have experienced, Steve, and all of us living here in Texas have experienced a few disasters.
Right.
We live near the coast, and we have many hurricanes and tropical storms that's resulted in historic floods, especially in these last few years.
Right.
The last major one being Hurricane Ike that we'll talk about a little later on. And while we weren't in the actual path of Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans and that whole area, we do know all too well the destruction it caused because people that evacuated Louisiana came here for shelter.
They
and
sure
didn't have
did.
any
Many
homes
of them
to go back to. So our population increased because of that.
A lot of them stayed here for sure.
That's right.
Well, disasters come in many different types and forms. There's natural disasters, of course, and then there's disasters that result from human error. And then there's those which are a combination of the two.
Right.
But sometimes truly bizarre disasters just happen. And the following comes from an article. I think, didn't you say that it came from Britannica.com?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
great
tell us
article
about
on Britannica.com. It was called 7 Strange Disasters. And the first one was the one we alluded to earlier during our calendar, the Tunguska event of 1908. Tunguska, capital Tunguska. On June 30th, 1908, a large and powerful explosion occurred in the stratosphere above the remote taiga forest near the, this is a hard word, Pudkamennaya, Pudkamennaya Tunguska River.
Pretty sure that's
in
not it,
central Siberia. I'm pretty sure I messed that up.
Sounded good.
Somebody can get us the correct pronunciation of that. Anyway, the blast caused by the explosion of an incoming comet or meteorite above the site leveled about 2,000 square miles of pine forest. That's roughly an area 45 miles long and 45 miles wide, a huge area.
That's right.
The force of the explosion was estimated to be roughly 1,000 times the power of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Investigators who believe that the object was a comet point to records that describe the development of, this is noctilucent clouds.
I think that's it.
And I believe that means clouds that glow at night. I looked up that word.
Yes.
Clouds that glow at night. Noctilucent clouds in the skies over Europe shortly after the blast, which might have been caused by the release of ice crystals in the upper atmosphere by a comet's sudden vaporization. However, other investigators argue that the object was a meteorite that might have been 300 feet in diameter. That would have been an enormous meteorite. But whichever one it was, it's fortunate that it hit in such a remote area of Siberia that it didn't hit over a populated area because it could have really been a devastating event.
Well, I'm a big fan of meteorites and stargazing and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember reading about this and about how a 1927 Soviet Academy of Science expedition discovered it.
Right.
Because there were no witnesses to the actual hit.
Impact,
in fact, they didn't know what it was when this expedition discovered it. They discovered an area of trees broken at the bottom of their trunks and laid out in away from the one central point, and it looked like toothpicks.
So it hit in the middle, and the trees were radiating
out from it. That's right,
like fanned
in a
out.
Huge area. The scientists were completely baffled by it, and an investigation was started to compare historic records to the findings at the site to figure out what had happened. And that's what they came up with, is that it was a meteor that had hit some sort of impact crater. It was
an enormous event, and so very interesting thing, the Tunguska event of 1908. Now, not too long after that, in a populated area, there was a different kind of disaster. This one was in Boston. In fact, it was on January 15th, 1919. That day began as any other ordinary day when suddenly a tidal wave of sweet, gooey insanity.
That's one way to describe it.
This would have been a bummer, but it would have been great.
Right. Probably would have drawn flies. Let's read that again. A tidal wave of sweet, gooey insanity sprang forth from a ruptured storage tank. The tank was holding fermented molasses, which was to be incorporated into industrial alcohol and used in the production of military-grade weapons. However, World War I had ended just 2 months earlier, so the molasses was put on hold until a different purpose could be found for it. Evidently, parked molasses can become volatile, and in this case, the expanding goo forced a rupture in the tank and sprang forth in a wave that was anywhere from 15 to 40 feet high and more than 150 feet wide, rushing down the street at more than 30 miles an hour.
Oh, wow.
That is crazy to imagine.
A wave of molasses at a huge amount. It toppled buildings, it buried horses, automobiles, and pedestrians. And then the cold temperature, it was in January, quickly thickened the molasses, and in the process trapped many of those who were unfortunately in the way. 21 people died and more than 150 were injured.
Oh my goodness.
See, so I've heard about this and read about it throughout the years. You know, it's come up. But can you imagine drowning in molasses?
That would just be a horrible thing, I would think.
And slow and just But can you imagine the tank? You know,
a tank that had to be a huge tank.
That's crazy. That's crazy large.
Anyway, I looked it up. It's over 2 million gallons. I had no idea it was fermented either. So hopefully the people that died in it got a little, drunk off of it before.
I don't know.
They got a buzz first.
Maybe it softened the blow a little bit,
but maybe don't hold that much in one tank.
Yeah, I suppose, and you know what? As wine ferments, it expands. So perhaps molasses does the same thing too. It expanded and it ruptured the tank because they were planning to put it to use, and then peace broke out, and so they didn't need it anymore.
And so let's just hold it in this huge tank.
Figure it out.
And I've heard, I don't know how true this is, but I've heard that in the summer when things heat up, you can still catch a whiff of it.
Really?
In the air.
More than 100 years later.
In that area.
That's interesting. Well, now there was a similar event that happened not that long ago in Europe on October the 4th, 2010. A retaining wall gave way at the Ajkai, I don't know that word, Timfoldgyár aluminum oxide plant in Ajkai, Hungary. My wife's family is all Hungarian. I would imagine they would know how to pronounce that, but I don't. The retaining wall held back a part of a waste reservoir containing a tremendous volume of red caustic sludge. Those are three words you don't really want to see together.
Yeah, is that a technical term?
Red caustic sludge. Yes. Several million cubic feet of the toxic material was released after part of the wall failed. The sludge moved downhill, covering low-lying villages in Hungary's Markal River Valley. At least 10 people were killed, with more than 120 others injured after they made contact with the sludge, which burned their skin and caused eye irritation. The wave of sludge made its way into the local rivers and streams, killing many plants and animals along the way. That was a nasty thing.
How sad!
All from a retaining wall giving way. Well, some might have heard of this. I've heard it mentioned briefly, but I didn't know that much about it until I came across this article. But in the beautiful town of Donora, Pennsylvania, it sits actually in what's normally a very picturesque area, the Monongahela River Valley in western Pennsylvania. In late October 1948, Donora was visited by a fog of death.
There's a term, a fog of death. This has got to. I've never heard of this. This has got to be bad.
I'm not sure. The red caustic sludge or fog of death. Pick your poison, I suppose. I'm not sure.
Can I have the molasses now?
Yes, that's a sweeter way to go, I suppose. Right. For 4 days, weather conditions trapped fluoride fumes and other emissions, such as carbon monoxide, hydrofluoric acid, and sulfur dioxide, from the region's steel smelting plants and zinc works. The stagnant air failed to move, and the high concentrations of airborne pollutants built up near the ground. Nearly 5,000 people suffered from the effects of this pollution episode, with many people developing fluorine poisoning. 22 people died, and some 50 additional fog-attributed deaths occurred within the following few months. For the next 10 years, in fact, the town's mortality rate surpassed those of its neighbors. Many of the survivors had permanent respiratory damage.
I can imagine.
Now, the story of this disaster in Donora was recounted in the late 1960s and early 1970s, particularly as the issue was taken up by Congress, and became evidence supporting the development of the passage of the 1970 Clean Air Act. And so perhaps at least something good did come out of it.
Right.
Now, a very similar thing happened actually had much larger consequences just 4 years later after Denora. In a pretty much a larger area and significantly more deadly results. London, England, is well known for its continuous fog and mist. Since the late 1800s, as industrialization has developed in the city, the naturally foggy conditions have often mixed with factory emissions and coal fire smoke to create a dreary, dense smog.
Right.
So now we've gone to dreary, dense smog. In December of 1952, a combination of coal-driven furnace smoke, fog, and cold conditions created one of the deadliest smog events in history. For 4 days, the thick smog killed between 4,000 and 12,000 people, as well as many animals.
That's crazy.
It's mystifying.
Right.
Oh, that's bad. That's bad. But okay, so I knew that London had this issue with coal, but every time I picture that back in the industrial revolution in the Victorian time.
But after World War II, there was things were still struggling to get back. Back on its feet again in London. A lot of buildings were still bombed out, and so people were still dealing with coal heat a lot. And
I didn't realize coal heat was that popular for that long.
Right, it is. For 4 days, the thick smog killed between 4,000 and 12,000 people. Most of the deaths were the result of severe bronchial asthma and pneumonia. Now, if you happen to catch the Netflix wonderful series called The Crown, they devoted one whole episode to what became known as the London Particular. This event.
That slide was crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
And now for something completely off topic and off kilter. Brace yourself for the oddity du jour.
Okay, so today's oddity is all about brand names and interesting brand names.
Oh, I like brand names.
So, in the way that they came about. So, Triscuits, okay?
I love Triscuits.
The baked wheat wafers.
Right.
It's not hard to see that part of their name is from biscuit.
Right.
But the tripart, it doesn't mean three. The name Triscuits is actually derived, and I came across this, and I hope it's not anecdotal. I hope it's actually true, but it came derived from electricity biscuits.
As in electric biscuits?
Electric biscuits. And I've seen some early advertising that would support this. Early advertising touted that Triscuit is baked by electricity, the only food on the market prepared that way in 1903.
Triscuit goes back that far?
It goes back that far. They were located in the Niagara Falls area, and oh my gosh, the dad jokes are really
terrible.
You're on a roll tonight.
Moving along.
Okay, so Snapple. I asked my daughter. I said, "Where do you think Snapple got their name?" And she told me exactly what I had thought, that the caps.
Yeah, snaps.
Snapple. It makes that sound.
Right.
That's not where they got it. Originally called, very unimaginatively called, Unadulterated Food Corporation.
Unadulterated Food Corporation.
Yes, that was their name to begin with.
Right.
They began selling a fizzy apple drink in 1972. I didn't realize Snapple was that old.
I didn't know it went back that far. I just remember from the 90s. It was really popular then.
I remember when they became popular, but I didn't know that they started back that far. One shipment went bad, and the fermented drink caused the caps to fly off the bottles. Because of this incident, I guess they just kind of embraced that incident and were able to laugh.
It's part of who we are,
They started calling the apple juice product Snapple from the combination of snappy apple. So they like the name so much, and let's face it, nearly any name is better than Unadulterated Food Corporation. They renamed the company in the early 1980s the Snapple Beverage Corporation, and all this time, I thought the name came from the little caps, the sound that the cap
Well,
makes.
it kind of did then, but,
Yeah.
But a different way.
And if Snapple would like to sponsor us.
No, yes.
Actually, if
Or
anybody
Triscuit.
from Snapple,
I love Triscuits.
Yeah, or Triscuits. If anybody from Snapple would or is listening, I'd like to say they moved from glass bottles to plastic bottles.
Uh-huh.
And I understand. But
Right.
let's go back to glass. I'm just saying. Okay, so Bluetooth. This is one of my favorite stories. So the Bluetooth technology, that serves the purpose of easing communications, right? So it's no surprise that it would be named after the Viking king of Denmark, Harold. Blatand. I think that's how you pronounce his last name, Blatand. Who was known, he left a legacy for establishing communications between Denmark and Norway in a very non-violent manner. And his nickname was Bluetooth.
Harold the Bluetooth.
Harold Bluetooth. Some sources say it was because of his fondness for eating blueberries. I don't think that's really. Others say it was because he had a dead tooth that turned kind of blue looking.
That's probably more realistic.
That's what I'm thinking, but who knows? The reason he was called that's lost, but we do know that he was called Bluetooth. And the logo for Bluetooth technology is actually called, it's a bind rune. And what that is...
Say that again.
Bind rune. B-I-N-D, like bind.
Bind.
And rune from the ancient...
the ancient runes, okay.
Ancient runes, which is two runes combined together to make a unique symbol. The logo is made from the two runes of H and B superimposed on each other. So, so if you look at your phone or what have you,
I'm gonna look right now.
I'm watching you two get out your phones. That
get
symbol
out your phones at home. Take a look at the Bluetooth symbol.
A bind rune. It looks like a B with kind of a V coming out from it.
Oh, okay. I can see it.
Greater than
B.
I've never looked at it that closely before.
In one of our future episodes, we're going to talk about runes and ancient writing and things like that, because that's one of my favorite topics.
Right.
And just off, as an aside, runes typically do not have horizontal strokes. They're all either
angled.
Vertical or angled, and the reason is because a lot of times they were carved in wood, and they didn't want to carve it within the grain in order to to keep from splitting the wood. Okay, back to brand names.
Right.
Bring us back to today.
Rune lesson number 1.
So Lego, everybody knows about Legos.
Lego, yeah.
Not fun to step on. Derived from the Danish words, we're just staying in the Danish theme of things.
Okay.
Leg gut, G-O-D-T, which means to play well. Lego also means put together in Latin, but that was completely a coincidence.
Interesting. Their company headquarters are in Denmark, I think. Correct? Right. I know that because I have a grandson. One of my many grandsons loves Legos, and he's 14. He still puts Lego sets together.
That's okay. I know an adult that still loves Legos.
Right.
Yeah, well, who doesn't? It is a really, really cool toy.
Yeah, he's quite good at it, too. Well, good deal. That was a great oddity.
Well, no, wait.
Oh, wait, there's more?
There's more.
Oh,
there's more.
All that oddity, and I thought, wow, we're saturated in oddity. But no, wait, there's more.
There's more. Nintendo. Literally Nintendo, D-O-U. Nin in Japanese means entrusted, and Tendao means heaven. So
entrusted in heaven.
So Nintendo is entrusted heaven, because they're very much about blessing their companies and taking the blessings and the luck and all of that out of it. So they want their names to mean things. And so Toyota is named after its founder, Kichiro Toyota. The name was changed. Okay, but his last name is spelled Toyoda.
Toyota.
Like
Toyota.
Yoda is in there.
Like Yoda. Okay.
The name was changed to Toyota with a T because Toyota with a D literally means fertile rice paddies. And so, which isn't negative. It's not negative. But another anecdote says that the word Toyota with a D uses 10 Japanese strokes to write, while Toyota with a T uses only 8. And 8 is considered a lucky number in Japanese culture.
I see.
And a funny story about that name, Toyota, is when Hooters waitress Jody Berry competed in a contest in May of 2001. The Panama City, Florida restaurant had a competition among their workers to see who could sell the most beer in a month, with the winner being presented with a brand new Toyota.
Nice.
Well, Jody knuckled down, and at the end of the month, she was the clear winner. She was blindfolded, led out into the parking lot, and presented with a toy Yoda.
Toy Yoda.
As in, may the force be with you, Yoda.
Yeah,
Needless
she
to
was
say,
quite happy.
she was not happy about this. She was furious. But the company management just laughed and chalked it up to a great April Fool's joke, because that's about the time that she was presented with this.
Right.
They didn't laugh for long because it was taken to court where the restaurant had to pay settlement.
And
Details
no.
of which
She ended up
are
getting a
under
Toyota.
wraps. That's right.
Yeah, they could have come up with a Toyota for her, don't you think?
Really?
Yes. I mean, and it wasn't like the corporation. It was the
local
the
store.
one
Right,
local
the one-
restaurant. But
the one
still,
store,
That's
yeah.
not. That's not.
No.
That's not nice. So Starbucks. The founders of Starbucks loved the novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville. They
Right.
wanted to name the coffee company, and you got to think about that.
Oh, no.
Pequod, which is the name of the ship in Moby Dick. Can you imagine? Like,
I'm thinking.
Hey, I'm going to go get my Pequod right now.
Yeah.
that's right.
No, that doesn't flow off the tongue.
No. But they settled on the name of the chief mate instead, Mr. Starbuck. And so they did name it after
Moby
a
Dick
character. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Okay, so Oreos. You guys know where that name came from?
Yeah, the evil cookies.
The evil cookies?
They're evil.
Oh, they're wonderful.
I'm not saying
They're
that.
wonderful.
Yeah, that's why
Yeah.
they're evil.
But nobody knows. Nobody knows where that name came from. Whoever created that name never wrote down how
Why?
they came up with it.
Oreo.
Possible theories are that they were named after the French word for gold, which is ore,
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
which featured very heavily on the early packaging, or from the Greek word for mountain, Oreo, which is that makes sense. And
Wow.
I think there is kind of a mountain on the cookie. I'm not sure.
I mean, they were digging for it. I mean,
Well, and the cookies were shaped like a mound at the very beginning. But the real process behind the name is lost to history.
I like to stick an Oreo on a fork. Put a fork to the side of it, and then you dip it in the milk. That way you don't get your hands all messed up.
Oh no,
yeah,
that's
that's
just
why you lick
wrong.
your fingers.
Yeah,
Well, that's true, but-
yeah.
But not while you're driving.
Yeah, no.
One of my best memories, again, as a teenager, stopping at one of my friend's house, and he came out with a huge glass of milk and stretched from fingertip to thumb full of Oreo cookies.
Oh.
That's
He
called
got in my car with this big glass of milk. And
That's
off
called
he
a
went.
sleeve.
Yeah, a
I've
sleeve
never,
of
okay,
Oreos.
so I've never heard of anybody eating Oreos and dunking them in milk while driving.
Yeah,
Is
well,
that
I was
something-
driving. He was riding along, but I may have participated somewhat. Maybe that
Snacking.
was another near disaster. Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, those were great oddity du jours. That was I'm thinking of the old Johnny Carson show. Everything you ever wanted to know about brand names was on that list. Well, now back to the topic at hand, disasters. This was one that I had not heard of before. It's called the Alaska-Hawaii tidal wave.
No, I've never heard of that before either.
And this is actually on, there was no April Fool's joke, but it happened on April 1st, 1946. A 7.4 magnitude earthquake occurred just off the coast of Alaska's Umanak Island, U-M-I-N-A-K. The quake created a gigantic wave that shattered the lighthouse on the island, killing 5 people in the process. By the way, the
Goodness.
lighthouse was sitting on a point that was 30 feet above sea level.
Oh,
So that
wow.
wave really got up there. After leaving Umanak, the wave hit the open sea and headed south. 4.5 hours later, the wave reached Hawaii, which is 2,400 miles away. Now, do the math. That wave was traveling over 500 miles an hour.
I think, yeah.
As the first wave came in and receded, the water in Hawaii's Hilo Bay seemed to disappear. Boats were left on the seafloor next to flopping fish. Then the massive tsunami struck. In the city of Hilo, a 32-foot wave devastated the town, completely destroying almost a third of the city. The bridge crossing the Wailuku River was picked up by the wave and pushed 300 feet away. In Hilo, 96 people lost their lives. In other parts of Hawaii, waves reached up as high as 60 feet. Imagine a 60-foot wave. A schoolhouse in Lapahoho was crushed by the tsunami, killing the teacher and 25 students inside.
Oh, goodness.
Wow. This tsunami prompted the United States to establish the Seismic Sea Wave Warning System 2 years later. The system, now known as the Pacific Tsunami Warning System, uses undersea buoys throughout the ocean in combination with seismic activity detectors to find possible killer waves. So again, at least something good came from that.
And they're still adding buoys like crazy.
Right, I would suppose so.
And you got to understand, like, a tsunami does not look like a tsunami in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
It just is a long swell.
Right.
And it's when the seabed floor comes up, pushes that wave up. And wow.
And I think that the interesting part about before it got there, it sucked water out of the bay.
Right.
So quickly. I mean, it's 500 miles an hour.
Right.
That's fast.
And when that happens, you run.
Yeah.
You run.
If you can
so many
run,
people
get
want to
somewhere
stand
high,
there. If you're in a place that doesn't get tsunamis and it pulls out, so many people want to come and see what is happening. And
what's happening, and then they're down there when the wave hits.
Loss of life. Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just
It's amazing. Now, I do remember this one here in Texas. The summer of 1980 was one of the hottest and driest on record, especially in the southern part of the United States. Temperatures in Texas and Tennessee stayed in the triple digits for more than 40 days straight.
Wow.
It was very hot, very dry. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the temperature soared to 113 degrees and stayed there for 3 consecutive days. I mean, even at night, it wouldn't cool off hardly at all. It just stayed hot throughout the night. The heat wave claimed at least 1,700 lives. Elderly people living without access to air conditioning are the most at risk during heat waves. And it caused more than $20 billion in agricultural damage, as the heat wave was accompanied by a prolonged drought, or as we say in Texas, drouth. That's the way that my mother would pronounce it. We were having a bad drouth with a TH at the end.
I have never heard anyone say that.
Oh, you haven't been in West. Maybe it's more of a West Texas term.
Maybe.
What I remember about that heat wave was that wild animals were coming into town and cities looking for water. You know, there was no water to be found out in the countryside, so they were coming in and getting water out of people's deer and other kind of wild animals. In fact, I had a really interesting encounter with a skunk at that time. Fortunately, it was another near disaster, but I escaped unscathed.
Well, I remember this. I was a kid living in Louisville, Kentucky, and we didn't have air conditioning because we didn't really need it. It was more of a luxury there.
Right.
And I remember the adults talking about the heat wave, and the more they talked about it, the hotter I got. I specifically remember the temps were in the upper 90s, and I wanted to never forget that because it was historically hot. I remember as a kid remembering that we were in something historical.
Right.
And a few years later, I moved to Texas, and we still didn't have air conditioning. In fact, my parents didn't get a dishwasher or air conditioning until after I left home.
Wow.
And I remember thinking how much of a wimp we were back in the 80s. In this 80 heat wave in Louisville, and thinking that 90-degree temps were so unbearable.
Right.
I mean, and I say 90 degrees. It was 90-something degrees.
Welcome to Texas.
Yeah, and then we came to Texas. And I think we actually spent a summer in a mobile home without air. I don't know how I'm alive. That was another disaster.
One thing I also remember from that heat wave, I got married that summer. And my wife had never been out to West Texas, and there's a place out there I love going that's normally very beautiful in the mountains, and I've been always building this place up to her, how gorgeous it was. And when we got there, it was just burnt completely brown, not a thing growing at all. It looked like the backside of the moon. Well, now going from heat to cold, we have another disaster to talk about. This was the Great Blizzard of 1888. Up in the Northeast, cities are no stranger to winter weather, but every so often a blizzard comes through that catches even the most prepared cities off guard. The Great Blizzard of 1888, often referred to as the most severe and deadliest blizzard to hit the United States, was one of those. The so-called Great White Hurricane dumped between 10 and 58 inches of snow in cities from Maryland to Maine and brought along 45-mile-per-hour winds as well. More than 400 people died as a result of this unusual March storm. It was in March. I mean, it was already middle of March. So people were kind of thinking it might be springtime, and all of a sudden this enormous storm comes. One New York politician who actually died later of pneumonia shortly after the storm, he wrote to a friend that he had climbed over drifts so high that his head bumped against the street signs.
Oh, wow. Wow. And we're still dealing with the the phenomenon of
That's
having
right.
snow here, and
Back in February, right?
Just a few weeks ago, and which we almost never get snow, and if we do get it, it doesn't stick like a whole day. And we had several inches of it, and it was a disaster because we had rolling blackouts because of it.
And we
We're
found
just
out
not
our Texas grid was not quite up to the task of very cold weather prolonged, for sure.
There was a couple of historians that said it was the first time in recorded history that every county in Texas experienced the same event at the same time.
A freeze warning.
Texas is so huge.
A winter storm warning, I think is what it was.
300 it was winter storm warning in every county.
All the way down, 258 counties, I think, or 254, something like that.
So that was historic.
All the way down into the valley, which is usually way down there. It doesn't even freeze in the winter sometimes. So that was an amazing storm.
That really was. And it wasn't just Texas. It was all across the United States. But Texas we were very unprepared for it.
It seemed like the norther was taking it personally against us.
Well, a lot of my friends that live in Kentucky are like, "What's the big deal?" So you're getting freezing temperatures and snow, big deal. But when you don't have electricity,
right,
and not every house has a fireplace, that is a big deal. Exactly. There were people freezing to death.
Well, now I do remember this one also, and actually got to visit the site later on. In the same year, 1980, there must have been something really odd going on in the world that year.
1980s, wow.
1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens. Now, most people know about this, but if you weren't alive during that time, during the 1980 eruption, it would be hard to really fully understand the destruction. On the morning of May 18th, an earthquake caused the north face of Washington State's infamous volcano to slide away. That allowed the high-pressure gas inside to explode, causing an 80,000-foot eruption column that carried volcanic ash to 11 states. 57 people were killed, and the eruption caused more than $1 billion in damage. They had designated what they thought was a safe zone that people could go up to. Well, their safe zone wasn't big enough. Right. And so there were people that were kind of monitoring it, and there were a few people that lived in the area that refused to leave as well. It was a much bigger eruption than they were expecting. Now, back during the 90s, I lived in Seattle, Washington, and during that time, they opened an observation viewing area right in the blast zone. One of the things that they did, they purposed to allow it to recover naturally. They didn't go back in and replant trees, and they wanted to watch and see how the volcanic eruption area, the blast zone, would recover in nature without people interfering, basically. And so it's pretty interesting today as you go there. There are new trees, plants growing throughout the whole area. You might not really tell that there had been a blast there because it has recovered. That was now 41 years ago.
See, and I think that's very fertile, right? Isn't that really good?
It is very fertile.
The ash and everything is so good for plants. Well, one of the things that I remember reading about is that when Mount St. Helens was threatening to erupt, photographer Robert Landsberg, he set up his camera a few miles away to record it because, there were rumblings and there were things. They knew it was,
for a couple of months it had been
that's right.
making noise.
So when the eruption occurred, he realized that he was doomed. He was just too close to escape the ash cloud that was hurtling towards him. So what did he do? He kept taking pictures for as long as he could. Then he did his best to protect the film with his own body. He rewound the film back into its case, put everything in his backpack, and then lay down on top of it to protect the contents. 17 days later, his body was discovered, buried in the ash and his backpack beneath him. The film was intact and has provided valuable information for geologists studying the eruption. Lansing's photos were published in January 1981 issue of National Geographic.
And I've heard another photographer that was kind of doing the same thing, maybe a little further away, and he said, within a minute or two before the eruption, he said, the mountain looks like it's melting. It didn't erupt out the top. It actually kind of blew out the side
of it.
And so that sort of caught everybody off guard. Wow.
Now for today's bookshop spot, the part of the show where we take you on a virtual tour of one of the most magical of places, an independent bookshop.
So this bookstore, located in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, and Suite B at 220 Plaza Drive, is named Town Book Center Wine Bar and Cafe.
Oh, that covers it all.
It's a happening place. They have been serving the greater Trapp and Collegeville area for almost 30 years.
I'm sorry, is that Collegeville?
Collegeville.
Collegeville.
So P.K. Sindwani and his wife Indira founded the bookstore in 1990 to help support their growing family as P.K. found himself facing possible layoff. They named the store The Little Professor, a name many longtime customers still call it to this day. The
Little Professor. Okay.
That's right. The store owners were community-minded and tried to expand the identity of the bookstore as a community center. They introduced programs like Battle of the Books, now the Tournament of Books to coincide with March Madness, Storytown, a weekly story hour for children of all ages, and the Angel Tree, a program to provide books for local children and families in need around the winter holidays. So the bookstore flourished and changed locations as it grew, and eventually the name changed to Town Book Center for its location in Providence Town Shopping Center. At that time, the store also became the first bookstore in Pennsylvania to serve wine alongside books. And
it's a high time somebody did, don't you think?
I'm an advocate of that. The wine bar, though, because of the times, is currently closed. But while you can certainly purchase wine, you can't enjoy it in the store at this time. But surely that's going to change soon. In 2019, PK retired as owner and sold the bookstore to current owner Drew Mundry, who shares PK's vision for the bookstore as a local focal point for community building. As a proudly independent store, the Town Bookstore Center and Wine Bar is free to assist local residents and other businesses in the areas in ways that other businesses selling books cannot. The store has programs to assist families in saving money on required reading while simultaneously earning funds for school libraries. The store's name is still going strong after a decade and opens its door to special events at the community and public's requests.
Great.
Nice.
Always seeking new ways to be involved, the Town Bookstore and Wine Bar excitedly looks forward to their future as Trapp's and Collegeville's independent bookstore. So you can visit them on Instagram and Twitter at Town Book Center, Facebook, Town Book Center. And I need to say that town is spelled with an E on the end.
Of course.
But on Facebook,
so is Trapp.
Their Town Book Center and Wine Bar. They even have YouTube channel. So for their events are now virtual. And they have book signings and all of that kind of stuff. And I need to, just remind you guys to shop small. So the next time you're looking on Amazon for a book, maybe go to one of our bookshop spots.
Right. Exactly.
And now for something really smashing.
Well, our next disaster, back to our disasters. This was one of the largest natural disaster ever in the United States, the Great Storm of 1900 in Galveston, Texas. The Great Galveston Storm came ashore the night of September 8th, 1900, with an estimated strength of a Category 4 hurricane. It remains the deadliest natural disaster and the worst hurricane in U.S. history. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people died in Galveston Island, and in the nearby mainland, Texas' most advanced city, was nearly destroyed. Some 10,000 people were left homeless as thousands of homes and businesses were demolished by the wind and the waves.
Now, let me just stop you right there, because this is because this is kind of local to us, and we both know a lot of the history of it. The reason that it was so destructive wasn't necessarily because of the size and strength of the hurricane. We've had stronger hurricanes, and it was because of the and I know ignorance is such an ugly word, but because we didn't have nobody evacuated.
Advanced warning,
nobody evacuated.
Right.
And so it was the loss of life that made it such a huge
Galveston
disaster.
Is kind of right in the corner of the coastal bend of the Gulf of Mexico, and so as there's an enormous storm surge that comes, and Galveston actually, people don't realize it is on an island, just about not even half a mile to a mile off the mainland of Texas, and so it was there was nowhere to run to if it was too late. Even the causeway bridge that they had, a railway bridge, was impassable, and so A lot of people don't realize, though, that at that time, Galveston was the main city in Texas. It was the largest city in Texas. Houston was just sort of the junior cousin up the road a little bit, had not really quite got on track. In fact, at the dawn of the 20th century, Galveston was Texas' grandest city. It could boast the biggest port, the most millionaires, the swankiest mansions, the first telephone, and the first electric lights. After the 1900 storm, Galveston would never regain her status. Now, if you go to Galveston today, it's still a beautiful city, but you can still see some lovely old homes that did manage to survive the storm, and they all bear a plaque stating as such.
Right. We used to go down and watch plays at the Grand Opera.
Right.
I think that's what it's called, the Grand Opera House.
Right.
And they have pictures in the foyer of the damage that it had sustained and how it was built back. Galveston has a museum that's dedicated to the Great Storm with video showing photos of the destruction and telling stories of the inhabitants of the island. And one of our favorite authors, Eric Larson, wrote a book called Isaac's Storm. Now, did you read that one?
I read Isaac's Storm,
I did
too.
Yeah. And it's all about that storm. And in it, he describes the science of meteorology that was just gaining ground at that time.
Right.
And all of the politics that went on within it. The storm predictions from other countries to the south were ignored because of the arrogance of American meteorologists.
That's true.
Isaac Klein was the resident meteorologist of Galveston Island at the time, and he was convinced that, and this is so funny to hear this, he was convinced that a hurricane would never enter the Gulf. He felt that all earlier reports of hurricane-type storms were just people being dramatic. And while that paints
people getting carried away, oh goodness.
And while that paints him in a really bad light, he really was a good guy. He just was a little bit on the arrogant side, and his family did suffer and die. And I want to say he survived, but he lost some of his family, some of his children. Right. It's also very interesting to read the stories of the individuals and the families that went through the hurricane. Like, and this is going to be very heavy, the Sisters of Charity Orphanage.
Yeah, this is
As
terrible.
the water began to rise, the nuns and the children kept moving up the stories of the building until they were forced up to the roof. The nuns finally realized that they were all likely to be swept away, and this was happening in the night where all of the lights were off. It was so dark. And so the nuns took rope and they tied it around themselves and each of the children. The flood waters washed them away, and later, during cleanup efforts, the workers would find a body, then pull on the rope to uncover another body, and then another and another. 10 sisters and 90 children lost their lives to the storm.
Yeah.
In fact, the loss of life was so high and the survivors were so few that men were held at gunpoint to be forced to work clearing the devastation and the decomposing bodies. And I think at one point they actually took the decomposing bodies out into the Gulf and dumped them in the ocean.
They did. They had a big funeral pyre as well.
Right. Well, but the bodies that were dumped in the ocean came back.
Yeah. They ended up burning them.
I can't believe that they didn't foresee that happening.
Yes.
And then it was very much a militia type atmosphere. Not militia. That's not the word I'm looking for. What do you call it when...
Well, it was there was lawlessness for sure.
Lawlessness, but okay, there's a word I'm looking for that people. It was a military type situation.
Martial law.
Martial law.
That's
it. That's it. That's what I'm looking for. Anyone found with severed fingers or ears in their pockets were shot on sight, as they were looters gathering jewelry from the dead. And to end this story on a lighter note, the seawall project that was deemed too lofty and expensive a project before the storm was heartily embraced after the storm. The more populated east end of the island was raised 17 whole feet in elevation, and a wall was constructed to help prevent floods from future hurricanes. And there's no way to estimate the number of lives it saved since. And you can go and you can walk along
absolutely
the seawall.
The seawall today, it's still there, and that it's on the open end towards the Gulf, the open part of the Gulf of Mexico. Oddly enough, it's not on the backside, so there have been recent storms which brought flooding to the backwater side of Galveston. So anyway. Well, as if Galveston hadn't suffered enough, there was another disaster that occurred there several years later. This article comes from Britannica.com. It details a major disaster that occurred there in 1947. On the morning of April 16th, the French-owned ship Grand Camp was preparing to finish loading a consignment of ammonium nitrate fertilizer at the port of Texas City. Texas City is just right across the bay from Galveston. Around 8 a.m., the crew members noticed smoke in the cargo area where 2,300 tons of fertilizer had already been stowed. In order to keep the cargo intact, the crew decided not to use water to extinguish the fire. They instead tried unsuccessfully to snuff out the flames. Shortly after 9 a.m., the temperature inside the cargo area had risen enough to spark a massive explosion that was heard as far away as 150 miles away. I mean, it sent a boom that far away. My parents were going to school in College Station, Texas, which is more than 100 miles from Galveston, and they remembered hearing the boom and seeing the smoke from this event. The resulting fire destroyed the dock area and engulfed the nearby Monsanto Chemical Company plant. A mushroom cloud rose 2,000 feet into the air. 2 small airplanes that were passing above at the moment were destroyed.
Oh, goodness.
Burning shrapnel was sent flying, with much of it landing in industrial areas, setting fires, causing other damage. A nearby ship, the SS High Flyer, was carrying huge amounts of sulfur. It also caught fire and exploded. And crude oil tankers in the site burned for days, consuming massive amounts of petroleum. An enormous wave that was triggered by the blast flattened numerous buildings, leaving as many as 2,000 people homeless. The fact that the initial explosion had killed many of the town's fire crews and ruined its firefighting equipment exacerbated the disaster. So just one bad move after another as far as the Texas City disaster.
Well, now staying again within Texas, this is a little lighter. I mean, if you can call it a disaster,
an intentional disaster.
if you
we
can
did
call
this
it
one on
disaster
purpose.
lighter, but it is a little funny. The crash at Crush. So Crush, Texas, was a fictitious town 15 miles north of Waco, set up specifically for a one-day publicity event.
Yeah, this was good.
According to Wikipedia, the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad had first reached the Crush area in the 1880s during the construction of a route between Dallas and Houston. As the railroad expanded, the Katy replaced its 30-ton steam engines with newer, more powerful 60-ton engines, and subsequently a stockpile of the older units that were no longer in use began to accumulate. So William George Crush was a passenger agent for the Katy Railroad. And I guess he was looking at all of these engines piling up. He got the bright idea that a staged train wreck would generate much-needed publicity for the railroad during a time of national economic downturn.
Oh, well, that's a great idea.
What could go wrong, right?
Let's stage a train. Well, it'd be like the demolition derby of its time, I suppose.
He even managed to convince his superiors that it would be a great idea. And he wasn't the first. There was actually another train crash that was that he got his inspiration from.
A staged event?
It was a staged event, but it wasn't quite to this grand scale that he had imagined. So the event was set for September 15th, 1896, and the temporary town of Crush, named for the agent it was set up, so humbly named after William George Crush, was set up with 2 water wells, a circus tent borrowed from Ringling Brothers, a grandstand, 3 speaker stands, a platform for reporters, 2 telegraph offices, and a special train depot over which a giant sign proclaimed the new town as Crush, Texas. The plans for the day included lemonade stands, carnival games, medicine shows, and other sideshow attractions. The event was highly publicized and anticipated.
Well, and this was
1896.
Okay, right.
So a separate 4-mile segment of track was built for the event alongside the Katy Railroad, so that there was no chance of the runaway train could end up on the main line.
Okay.
Each end of the track. So they did have safety in mind.
Right.
He did have safety measures in mind.
We'll keep this off the main train line, okay? We'll
well,
build a special 4-mile track for it.
And he had more. Okay, so each end of the track was situated atop a low hill on opposite sides of the bowl-shaped valley in which the trains would meet. The locomotives to be used were 2 35 short-ton decommissioned Baldwin engines.
So old locomotives.
Number 999 and number 1001. There was no admission charged for the event. Proceeds were instead made on the train tickets sold to people traveling to see the spectacle.
Oh, okay.
There were safety precautions. On the day before the exhibition, railroad officials staged a test of the engines to pinpoint the exact location of the collision. Crush was assured by railroad engineers that this idea of his was a safe one, stating that the boilers on the steam engines had been designed to resist ruptures and that even in a very high-speed crash, they were unlikely to explode. Famous last words.
He didn't know anything about that molasses tank either. Rupturing.
Each engine had 6 boxcars to pull, and because the couplers used to link the cars were considered unreliable in a crash, the cars were chained together to prevent them from coming apart during the impact.
Sounds like they had all the bases covered.
Well, and
They got a
Crush
good
also
start.
insisted that people stay back a minimum of 200 yards, okay? So away from the track to allow but he did allow members of the press to be as close as 100 yards.
Okay.
So officials expected a showing of about 20,000 to 25,000 spectators, but the crowd swelled to over 40,000.
40,000 people out in the prairie in Texas in 1896.
And that's 40,000 train tickets. Well,
There
I mean,
you
I'm
go.
sure not everybody bought
Plus they bought
train
lemonade.
tickets, but yeah. So 4 p.m. was showtime, and the steam engines and their boxcar trains were set in motion, hurtling toward each other at speeds of up to 60 miles an hour, their steam whistles screaming. The trains collided with a huge roar of splintering timbers, wrenching metal, and billowing black smoke. Some accounts say that the engines reared up against each other before falling over on their sides. The collision came to an end, and silence fell for just a moment before both boilers exploded, sending hot shrapnel through the crowd.
Wow.
The event that was supposed to be harmless killed 3 people and maimed many others.
What about the engineers that were driving? Driving? Did they just start them and jump off?
Yeah,
or what?
I think they just started. There was no one on the trains.
I see.
In an article for TexasCoopPower.com, Martha Deeringer reports that teenager Ernest Darnall, who watched the spectacle from his perch in a mesquite tree, died instantly when a heavy hook on the end of a wrecking train hit him between the eyes and split his skull.
Oh.
Several dozen people were injured, including those scalded by steam and burned by jagged hot shrapnel. A flying bolt ripped out the right eye of official event photographer Jervis Dean, who was on a stand less than 100 feet from the track. The spectators stood stunned as they took stock of the serious injuries inflicted by the crash. Doctors quickly started tending to those who were wounded, some as far away as a mile.
Wow. A mile away.
A mile away and still were hurt. Then there was a rush forward. This is so typical. There was a forward rush by those who were not hurt to snatch up as many souvenirs from the morbid disaster as they could carry. William Crush was immediately fired. Even though his superiors thought, had okayed this. But a few days later, it was discovered that the crash had accomplished its purpose. The story was repeated in headlines around the world, and business for the Katy Railroad boomed. Crush was quietly rehired.
Crushed it.
There was even a song written about the crash by Scott Joplin, the famous ragtime composer, who was speculated to have actually been in attendance there.
Okay.
The song was called The Great Crush Collision March. The
We'll have to look that one up.
Yeah, I don't know. I tried to look it up. I didn't come across it, but I tried too hard. So maybe it's out there.
Yeah.
The injured and the family of the deceased were compensated by the railroad. Dean, the photographer injured by a flying bolt, was one of those that received a settlement and a lifetime pass for the Katy Railroad.
So you lost your eye, but you got a
But,
free pass.
come ride
to
with
the
us.
train.
I think I just found it.
All right, play some of
Let's
that.
try
You got
this
it?
again.
This is the Great Crush Collision March.
By Scott Joplin.
It makes me think of those silent movies that,
Right.
the music that would play in silent movies of a real dramatic scene,
And this is where the one lady screams her head off, but you can't hear it.
Right. All right, that's fascinating.
Oh.
Thank you, Phil.
Yep.
Good deal. Well, now we have another disaster to talk about. And, Leah, I've been teaching history for many, many years, 41 years, and yet I've never heard about this incident until I started researching for this show. Unfortunately, it's not a particularly proud moment in our country's history. It's called the Port Chicago disaster. But we're not talking about Chicago, Illinois, though, but this is it's a small Navy town called Port Chicago, California.
I've never heard of this either.
This port consisted of a very long pier, which angled out into the ocean and was equipped with train rails. Ships could be loaded with supplies brought by rail on either side of the pier. So, in other words, the pier went out from the coast, kind of angled out. Ships could come to both sides, and the rails would go out on the pier, and they could, load ships really quickly from both sides that way. This was a very busy port during World War II, as ships came here from all over the Pacific theater to be resupplied. And the main supply that was provided at this particular port was munitions. Munitions transported through this port included bombs, shells, naval mines, torpedoes, and small arms ammunition. However, none of the sailors or officers at the facility had any training or experience in the handling or loading of explosives. Now, making matters worse, the sailors at Port Chicago were all African American, and the officers were all Caucasian. This appears to have hampered communication between the sailors and the officers, as many of the workers' concerns were not passed up the chain of command. Making matters even worse, the base commander established a competition between different barracks to encourage the men to load ships faster.
So this is just a disaster waiting to happen.
Sure. A disaster waiting to happen, exactly. The Liberty ship SS E.A. Bryan docked in the inboard landward side. The pier angled out a little bit, and so there was one that was more toward the land. They call it the inboard side of Port Chicago's pier at 8:15 a.m. on July 13th, 1944. The ship arrived at the dock with empty cargo holds, but was carrying a full load, 5,293 barrels of heavy fuel oil for its intended trip across the Pacific Ocean. At 10 a.m. that same day, seamen from the Ordnance Battalion began loading the ship with munitions. After 4 days of around-the-clock loading, 4 days, about 4,600 tons of explosives had been stored in its hold. The ship was about 95% full by the evening of July 17th. On the opposite side of the pier, the SS Quinault was being prepared for loading. Its holds were empty, but its fuel tanks were about half full. A boxcar delivery containing a new airborne anti-submarine depth charge was being loaded into the number 2 hold of the Bryan. These charges were more sensitive than TNT to external shock and container dents. So very sensitive material, and yet they're rushing to get them loaded as quick as they can. On July 17th, at about 10:18 p.m., witnesses reported hearing a noise described as a metallic sound and rendering timbers, such as made by a falling boom. Immediately afterward, an explosion occurred on the pier and a fire started. 5 to 7 seconds later, a more powerful explosion took place as the majority of the ordnance within and near the SSEA Bryan detonated in a fireball seen for miles. An Army Air Force pilot flying in the area reported that the fireball was 3 miles in diameter.
Oh,
3 miles of a fireball.
3 miles in diameter. Goodness.
Chunks of glowing hot metal and burning ordnance were flung over 12,000 feet into the air. The E.A. Bryant was completely destroyed, and the Quinault was blown out of the water, torn into sections, and thrown in several directions. The stern landed upside down in water 500 feet away. We're talking about a huge ship, broken in pieces, and a big piece of it thrown 500 feet away. A Coast Guard fireboat that happened to be nearby was thrown 600 feet up the Sacramento River, where it sank. The pier, along with its boxcars, locomotives, rails, cargo, and the men loading it, were blasted into pieces. 320 sailors and civilians were killed, and 390 more were injured. Now, about a week after the incident, the remaining officers rounded up the surviving sailors who were not in the hospital, and they bussed them to their next assignment. To their shock, the new assignment was just down the coast at the Mare Island Naval Port, and their new job was loading more munitions on the ships. Yeah. Well, about 50 of the men refused to follow orders, and they were court-martialed for mutiny. They spent the rest of the war in prison and were issued dishonorable discharges.
Oh, wow.
Now, in the 1990s, some 50 years later, one of the sailors, his name was Freddie Meeks, petitioned President Clinton for, and he received a pardon. But none of the other 49 have actually ever been pardoned. They've all passed away by now. But there are efforts underway by some of their family members and some others to try to get a pardon granted for them as well. In the investigation after the Port Chicago disaster, it was determined that segregation of the ranks the following spring, in March of 1945, the Navy became the first military branch to begin integration of its ranks.
Goodness.
So perhaps this did lead to a needed change.
Wow, that is so sad.
A terribly sad story, and people having jobs that were that they were not trained for.
Well, now we've talked a lot about chaos and destruction, and there's so many other things that we could have mentioned. There's so many. I mean, we just kind of really picked picked out certain ones, but there's so many disasters out there. So we want to leave you with some things that'll give you a little bit of a laugh. Steve, have you ever heard of the Waffle House Index?
I've never heard of this one, no.
Okay, so I'm a big fan of Waffle Houses. I don't know. Like,
throughout the South, if you don't know.
Everywhere.
If you live somewhere else, you might not have heard of Waffle
and
House.
They're open
all the time.
All the time.
24/7. And my kids, like some of my kids are like, I cannot believe you would even eat there. And then others.
Hey, don't knock it till you try it.
Oh, right. It's awesome. It's a little bit, it's kind of like a truck stop. A little bit,
right.
It caters to truckers and things like this. So, they stay open 24 hours, like Phil said, to serve all meals, but their specialty is breakfast, hence the name Waffle House.
Waffles,
well,
right.
Since these little diners stay open 24/7, the various organizations that monitor disaster areas like FEMA and the Red Cross, and I think specifically FEMA,
right.
tend to look at Waffle Houses to see how well they are faring after a disaster. They found that it's a pretty good indication of how the area itself is dealing with a disaster. For example, the index has 3 levels. So green is if the local Waffle House has a full menu.
I see.
The restaurant has power and damage is limited or to no damage at all. That means that they've bounced back after whatever hurricane, riot, what have
right.
you. Yellow, they have a limited menu, no power or only power from a generator.
Okay.
And food supplies may be low. And then red is the restaurant is closed, indicating severe damage, severe flooding, or a pandemic. So if you are in an area where a disaster strikes and the Waffle House is closed,
that's a pretty severe disaster.
You're
Go somewhere
doomed.
else.
Yeah.
The index was developed by FEMA because they know that the restaurant, along with stores also like Home Depot and Walmart, do a lot of business when disaster strikes.
Right.
And so they compared with other businesses, have more organized risk management and disaster preparedness.
That's interesting. I've never heard that, but it makes sense.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. Okay, so here's
as the Waffle House goes, so goes the recovery.
Yeah.
So here's a disaster that just it cracks me up, and nobody was seriously hurt.
Okay, good. It's a good one to end on.
Okay, so on November 12th, 1970, the carcass of a large sperm whale was spotted on the beach in Florence, Oregon. The whale was 45 feet long and weighed an estimated 8 tons. That's a huge, rotting, stinky problem, and somebody had to do something to remove it. And at that time, the Oregon Highway Division, now called the Oregon Department of Transportation, had jurisdiction over beaches and decided to dispose of the whale the same way they would clear a large boulder from the highway construction project.
So they had a whale of a time.
They would just blow it up.
Oh, okay.
Using dynamite. So, so what could go wrong? Why not? It's the highway department. What else are they going to do? They don't have, doctors or vets or whatever.
This will be cool. I think it's probably went into the thinking.
Probably.
This is going to be good.
And there's video of this, y'all.
Of course,
cool.
Reporter Paul Lindman opens by saying, the Oregon State Highway Division not only had a whale of a problem on their hands, it had a stinking whale of a problem. So the cameras rolled, and Lindman continued to report on the endeavor as workmen loaded the whale with explosives. Sorry, it's pretty funny. And this
loading the whale with explosives.
Look this up on YouTube. I think we'll link to it. So, and then and while they're doing this, the sand dunes are filling up with spectators.
Just like the train wreck. I think you could not look at it.
They should have been selling lemonade. There was an expected countdown, but when the blast occurred, the humorous situation turned into a run for cover situation as chunks of rotting blubber rained down over a very large area. Lindman went on record as actually saying, And this is a quote: "The sand dunes were covered with spectators and landlubber newsmen, shortly to become land blubber newsmen, for the blasted blubber beyond all believable bounds."
No, that's a great sentence. Very alliterative. The blasted blubber beyond all believable bounds. There you go.
He was actually on site, and he ran for cover too. Like, you can start hearing, if you just hear the, it's a video, but if you just listen to it, you can start hearing the chunks start hitting. Surprisingly, no one was hurt, but a large chunk of whale fell on a car parked about a quarter of a mile away and crushed it. Like, crushed the passenger side of the roof in.
I'd like to hear that insurance call.
What happened? I got hit by a whale.
Hit by a flying whale.
That's right. That's right. I'm sure the insurances hear about all kinds of things, though. In 2015, over 40 years after the whale explosion, Paul Lindman was interviewed about that day. And when asked about that famous or infamous line about the blasted blubber, he laughed and said, "I've had my grown sons repeat that to me so many times, I'm sick to death of it."
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
He went on to state that it's been reported that that clip was the single most watched television news story in history.
Wow.
And I sourced this information from theexplodingwhale.com because, yes, the incident has its own domain name and website over
Their
50
own website.
years later.
And now it's time, boys and girls, for the Trivia Challenge.
All right, everybody, it's time for our Trivia Challenge. You know how this works. Like and follow our Facebook page at Remnant Stew Podcast. Like and share this episode post and put your answer to the Trivia Challenge question in the comments on that post. The first person to do all of that will be the winner and will be mentioned on an upcoming episode of Remnant Stew. Oh, you'll be forever immortalized.
Okay, so here we go. Our question is, what disaster was averted in 1969 by a top-secret meteorologist? And what was that meteorologist's name?
A top-secret meteorologist.
That's right. Okay. Remnant Stew is created by me, Leah Lamp. Dr. Stephen Meeker and I research, write, and host each episode. Audio is produced by Philip Sinquefield, who also gives us all kinds of dad jokes. Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod with voiceover by Morgan Hughes. Special thanks to Judy Meeker and to Harbin Gould for helping us out as well. You can connect with us through our Facebook and Instagram at Remnant Stew Podcast or through our email at staycurious@remnantstew.com. Send us an email and say hi and tell us about your favorite episodes so far. And one new thing on our website is buy us a coffee.
Yeah,
so if you'd like to support us, then please buy us a coffee, because while this is free to listen to, it's not free to produce. Okay. And so you could help us out that way as well.
Well, now, before you go, please hit the subscribe button so you won't miss an episode. Please take the time to give us a review on iTunes. We'd love to see those reviews. There's a convenient link on our website to make that easy for you. As always, share Remnant Stew with your friends, family, and your FEMA or Red Cross disaster relief representative. And until next time, please remember to be kind and always stay curious.